Welcome to the Forum on Midterm Elections hosted by the Weidenbaum Center on the Economy, Government, and Public Policy, also in conjunction with Washington University's School of Law, Public Interest and Policy Speaker Series. My name is Andrea Reeves. I'm a professor of political science and the director of the Weidenbaum Center. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon in person. Also, hello to all of our friends on Zoom. Just to let you know, with the permission of our panelists, we are recording the event this afternoon. I want to thank the law school for their co-sponsorship, especially Professor Karen Tokars, and also all of the staff of the Weidenbaum Center, especially Alana Baim, for organizing this event. Today, our plan is to have a discussion of what the midterms mean for St. Louis, for Missouri, for the United States, and beyond. In many ways, it was just another midterm election. We saw 435 members of the House of Representatives up for re-election, little less than a third of the US Senate, and many other state and local offices around the country. According to the Associated Press, Democrats now have 50 seats in the US Senate, which gives them at least a technical majority since the vice president casts a tie-breaking vote. The Republicans have 49 seats, and of course, there's one additional seat to be decided in Georgia, and we'll see a runoff for that in early December. The Associated Press has called the House of Representatives in favor of the Republican Party. Though there are still a few more uncalled races, it appears that the Republicans will govern with a slim majority in the House. In other ways, we find a nation at a moment of profound political change. News has seemed to break hourly, daily since the midterms. Just earlier today, Nancy Pelosi announced that she, along with the full slate of Democratic leadership, would not seek those positions in the House caucus. The Republicans are regrouping from unmet expectations in their performance in the midterms. They're now churning over their process to pick their leader, who will be the presumptive Speaker of the House. Donald Trump has announced he is again running for president, despite what seems to be a yet unseen level of rejection among Republican elites. And we are still left reeling after a worldwide pandemic and the fallout that it continues to have. And we're faced with existential questions about the robustness of our democracy after January 6th and the events that led up to it. To help us better understand our world as we now find it, it's my pleasure to welcome our four distinguished panelists, who I will now introduce to you. I'm going to do it in alphabetical order, so across the table. Travis Crum is an associate professor of law at Washington University. Professor Crum's scholarship explores the relationship between voting rights, race, and federalism. His current projects examine the 15th Amendment as an independent constitutional provision and the role of racially polarized voting in redistricting. Professor Crum received his JD from Yale Law School, his master's degree from the London School of Economics, and his undergraduate degree from Johns Hopkins University. And actually, most importantly, we just discovered that we actually have the same hometown. So he went to high school across the way from where I did back in Maryland. Matthew Hayes is an associate professor of political science at Washington University. Professor Hayes's research lies at the intersection between race and political representation. His current research investigates how citizens evaluate the importance of descriptive, symbolic, and substantive representation. Professor Hayes has also published on redistricting and legislative responsiveness, the role of ethnic identity and skin tone in determining perceptions of ethnic discrimination, and how personality shapes political trust. Professor Hayes received his PhD from the University of Illinois and his undergraduate degree from the University of Chicago. Andrea Katz is an associate professor of law at Washington University. Professor Katz teaches and writes about constitutional law with a focus on the development of presidential power. Her work explores questions of constitutional design, the separation of powers, and popular attitudes toward the Constitution. She also has an interest in comparative constitutional law and has published work on courts, constitutional amendments, and presidential power in countries including Brazil, Colombia, and Uruguay. Professor Katz received her PhD in political science from Yale University, her JD from Yale Law School, and her bachelor's degree from Yale College. Michael Olson is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Washington University. His research focuses on the relationship between electoral and legislative institutions and legislative representation in the United States using observational data from across history and levels of government. In addition, Professor Olson's interests include the effects of party competition, the consequences of electoral and legislative reforms, and the central importance of the right to vote. Professor Olson received his PhD from Harvard and his undergrad degree from Vanderbilt. So now what I'm going to do is ask each of the panelists in turn to share some thoughts, some takeaways that they have around the 2022 midterms. When they're done, I may ask a follow-up question or two, and then we'll take questions from the audience. As a reminder, to our friends on Zoom, we have an open chat box, and I'm actually monitoring it right here from my seat. And so as you have questions, feel free to type those in the chat box, and I'll do my very best to get to some of those this afternoon. So with that, I will hand it over to Professor Crum.
All right, thank you, Andrew. Thank you to the Weidenbaum Center for putting together this event, and it's great to be here with other fellow junior colleagues in person and sharing this with you all at home. So I'm going to talk briefly about two Supreme Court cases that the court is hearing this term involving voting rights. The first is Merrell versus Milligan, which is a case out of Alabama. Alabama is 27% African-American, and it has 7 congressional districts, but only one of those congressional districts is majority Black, and that has been true for several redistricting cycles. Plaintiffs decided to challenge this lack of proportionality within Alabama's congressional map under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 2 is a nationwide prohibition against racial discrimination in voting, and in order to bring a successful Section 2 challenge, you need to satisfy what are known as the jingles factors. You have to satisfy 2 things. The first is that you can create a majority minority district in a compact geographic area. Basically, you have to show that the population there is big enough and residentially segregated enough to form a core of a district. And secondly, you need to prove racially polarized voting. Now, that latter point is not really contested in this case. The levels of racial polarization in Alabama are quite high. They're actually quite similar to what they were in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, just the party IDs have changed. So the plaintiffs brought this suit, and a district court composed of 2 Republican appointees and 1 Democratic appointee issued an approximately 200-page opinion saying that the plaintiffs had proved their case, that they were going to issue a preliminary injunction, and that the Alabama congressional map could not be used in 2022. Alabama then took that case into the Supreme Court on the so-called shadow docket, where you don't get oral argument, briefing is expedited, you don't get full decision-making on the merits, and the court stayed that decision on a policy called the Purcell principle, which holds that when you're very close to the election, you don't make changes, you don't rock the boat. And similar things were done in Louisiana, and the specter of something similar happening occurred in Georgia. And that might have changed the result in a couple races in those states. Now, before the Supreme Court in the October hearing, Alabama is making some very bold claims about the Voting Rights Act. It's arguing that intent is basically an element that needs to be proved, even though Congress made very clear in the statute's text that discriminatory results is all that's required. They're arguing that states should be required to engage in what they call race-blind redistricting, which is where you look at the maps and don't consider racial data at all. And if you were to replicate that across the United States, it would have devastating consequences for minority political representation. And then finally, Alabama is arguing that under principles of constitutional avoidance, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act should not apply to single member redistricting plans, even though it's applied to those for 3 decades. Now, thankfully, at oral argument, even the conservative justices on the court were largely rejecting Alabama's most aggressive positions about showing discriminatory intent and about constitutional avoidance. However, they did seem to be interested in these so-called race-blind arguments. And I think we'll have to wait and see until sometime in the spring or early summer how that gets resolved. The second case I'm going to talk about is called Moore versus Harper. Now, this is a case out of North Carolina where the North Carolina state legislature drew a heavily partisan gerrymandered map in favor of the Republican Party. Plaintiffs sued. The North Carolina Supreme Court held under the state constitution's elections clause, free speech clause, equal protection clause, that it was an egregious partisan gerrymander and struck it down. The North Carolina legislature was then given an opportunity to pass a new remedial map. But that map was not much better, and it was enjoined as well. And so a district court there, a state district court, drew an interim remedial map that was supposed to be used for this election only. Now, the North Carolina state legislature has challenged that map on the grounds that it violates the so-called elections clause. And I'll get out my little pocket constitution here and tell you what the elections clause is. Article 1, Section 4 says that the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. And the argument, according to the state legislature, is, well, that means us and no one else, not a state court, not an independent redistricting commission, just us. Now, that might seem simple. It might seem very straightforward, but it goes against a lot of doctrine and a lot of practice. So in 1916, the Supreme Court held that the legislature also includes referenda. In 1932, the Supreme Court held that gubernatorial vetoes are encompassed within the meaning of legislature. And most recently, in 2015, the court held that independent redistricting commissions can be part of the legislature. And in the partisan gerrymandering case known as Rucho versus Common Cause a few years ago, the court, in saying that you could not bring federal partisan gerrymandering claims, pointed to the fact that state courts could police this problem on their own via state constitutional provisions. Now, this independent state legislature theory has gotten a lot of attention recently because it came up through numerous shadow docket rulings during the 2020 presidential election, involving attempts to extend the time in which absentee ballots could be received, to get rid of notarization or witness requirements for absentee ballots. And the court's conservatives issued a lot of decisions casting doubt on some of these precedents. Now, it's too early to tell what various path the court might take in this case. The parties and the amici in the case are putting forward a true panoply of options. Some of the things that are on the table are a narrow ruling that says that you just can't supplant the state legislature like the North Carolina Supreme Court did, that courts can't impose their own maps, though they can strike down maps. Another theory would be much more broader, namely that state legislatures operate in a law-free zone. They can't be constrained in any way. And I think oral argument is going to be very illuminating in that case. And this case is important for not just redistricting, but the right to vote more generally, because many state constitutional provisions govern things like absentee ballots, the secret ballot, caucuses, et cetera. All these are on the table from this case. But what this case is not about, and I think this is something that's been very prominent in the media, is a fear that this case could allow state legislatures to overturn presidential elections in 2024 when they do not like the results. I do not think that this case implicates that principle. I don't think that this case would answer questions about due process and fairness in the separate constitutional provision in Article 2 in the 12th Amendment governing the casting of electoral college votes in presidential contests. So that aspect of the case, I think, is a bit hyperbolic that you see in the media. So these are the two cases that the court has heard or will hear this fall, and we'll find out in the spring or maybe sometime in June what the answers will be.
Thank you, Professor Hayes.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Professor Reeves, for organizing this panel and the Weidenbaum Center for hosting it. I just want to give you my sort of 4 key takeaway points from what I saw in the 2022 midterm elections. I'm going to focus primarily on my area of expertise, which is racial and ethnic politics. I think the first key takeaway point for me from the election, in the run-up to the election, there was a lot of concern about if Black and Latino voters would flee the Democratic Party and vote Republican. And from what we saw, Black and Latino voters stayed loyal to the Democratic Party or stayed home. What we've seen from recent polls recent polls and surveys that have been released is that upwards of 85% of Black voters reported casting ballots for Democratic congressional candidates, gubernatorial candidates, and Senate candidates. That's especially high for Black women voters, although Black men tended to vote for Democrats in the high 70s. Latino voters outside of Florida remained very loyal to the Democratic Party, ranging from 60 to 70% of Latino voters cast ballots for Democrats in states like Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, these really pivotal sort of swing states. Florida is a completely different story. Florida Latinos tend to be more Republican and indeed seem to be solidifying as a Republican voting bloc. One of the other sort of pieces of this, though, is a turnout story. Despite stories you might have heard about there being a youth quake or heightened turnout among minority communities, Black and Latino voters actually seem to have made up a smaller share of the electorate than in previous midterm elections. So in Georgia, where they track voter turnout and registration by race, it looks like African-American voters made up a smaller share of the electorate than in 2018, and the same is true for Latino voters as well. So on this, I think this suggests that Black and Latino voters are not becoming more Republican. And I think part of this is a strategic misstep by Republican politicians and strategists. We do see increasing numbers of Black and Latino voters self-identifying as conservative. But what conservatism means in these communities is very different from what it means in white communities. And that's true even among religious Black and Hispanic voters as well. And I'll return to this in a second. The second thing I want to touch on, Professor Crum's already mentioned, but I think that racial gerrymander probably did play a role in the election results that we saw. So in Louisiana, Georgia, and Alabama, plaintiffs have brought cases arguing that an additional majority-minority House seat could be created in those states. Whether or not they succeeded in this actually looks like it's going to be pivotal in control of the House. The Republicans are going to have a very, very slim majority in the House of Representatives. With 3 additional majority-minority seats, or had New York Democrats not shot themselves in the foot and redistricted a safe Democratic seat to be competitive, Democrats would likely hold the House in addition to holding the Senate. And that's a phenomenon we've not seen since 1978, that an incumbent president was able to defend both the Senate and the House. The third takeaway point for me in the election is that unpopular policies are unpopular. In the run-up to this election, the Republican Party and Republican Supreme Court justices have been advancing very unpopular policies. In particular, the Dobbs decision that repealed Roe v. Wade was incredibly unpopular. Republican efforts to overturn Biden's student loan forgiveness plan are incredibly unpopular. In 6 states, there were ballot initiatives that dealt with reproductive rights, and the pro-choice side prevailed in all 6 of those states. And I think it's worth noting that in Michigan, where there was a ballot initiative to enshrine by law the right to reproductive choice, that actually received more votes than Gretchen Whitmer, who coasted to a Democratic victory for governor. This is also a key issue for many voters of color, and especially women of color. 77% of Black voters would support a nationwide law protecting reproductive rights. The same is true of 70% of Latino voters. And in Pennsylvania, which was a very narrow Democratic Senate victory, reproductive rights was the top issue for Black women voters. And Black women voters were the core of the Democratic Party's success in 2022 in Pennsylvania and other states. And in addition, Americans just broadly like the student loan forgiveness plan, despite what the media has reported on. And this is true for voters of color in particular. So 89% of African-American voters and 79% of Latino voters support Biden's plan to forgive $10,000 to $20,000 of student loan debt for borrowers. And my final takeaway point is, I think the 2022 midterm elections were a vote for normalcy and a vote for sanity. In many ways, most voters don't pay attention to politics most of the time. And when they tune in around election season and they hear very sort of outside the mainstream positions, I think these less engaged voters were willing to turn out to vote and cast ballots against more extreme candidates. So, for example, election denying candidates, candidates who refuse to recognize the results of the 2020 election. They lost races for governor in key swing states like Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Wisconsin. Secretaries of state who also supported false election fraud claims lost their races in Michigan, Arizona, and Nevada. In addition, Trump-backed candidates fared much more poorly in the election than non-Trump-backed candidates. Some political scientists are estimating that it was about a 5 percentage point drag on their election returns. And we saw this in key races like Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania, Blake Masters in Arizona, losing in close races that definitely could have been winnable in a normal midterm election with an incumbent Democratic administration. And even when these kinds of candidates won, they tended to fare less well than more mainstream candidates. So if we look at Ohio, which is a fairly solidly Republican state at this point, J.D. Vance won his senatorial election against Ryan. Timothy Ryan? Yeah, Timothy Ryan. But he received far fewer votes than Mike DeWine did for governor, running in the exact same state. And so I think we also saw a rejection of political neophytes, people who had no relevant political experience. So Carrie Lake in Arizona, whose most recent expertise was as a newscaster, didn't fare so well. So I think for me, what I take out of this is some optimism that voters prefer boring politics and don't like conspiracy theories, election denial, and extreme candidates. And so those are the 4 takeaway points I had from the 2022 election, and I'm looking forward to carrying on this conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. Professor Katz.
All right. I'll pick up the theme of boring and talk about the Biden presidency. No, I want to give a sort of presidency spin on the midterm results and discuss 2 questions specifically. 1, what do these results say about the Biden presidency? And 2, what does the result mean for the presidential agenda going forward? So it certainly speaks to our current, disenchanted moment of politics that one party would celebrate even when they gave up control of one of the houses. But this was also, to put it in context, a historic result. NPR just wrote that first-term midterms are usually a cold shower for presidents. The only years in recent American history where the incumbent party did not lose seats after 2 years were 1934, and this is during the ongoing Great Depression, and the massively popular FDR, 1998, which has been read as a backlash to the Clinton impeachment, which many voters thought went too far, and 2002, which has been explained by a rally around the flag effect after 9/11. So this was a seeming perfect storm, right? A president with low approval ratings in the middle of massive economic inflation. And again, of course, this historical pattern. So all of this would predict a bloodbath. And yet, of course, as we've discussed, it was far from a bloodbath. The Democrats had 222 seats in the House to defend. As of now, Republicans flipped a net total of 6 and may come away with 10 or so when all is said and done. In the Senate, Democrats had to defend 14 seats. They held 13, flipped 1, and the last is the Georgia runoff, which it seems could certainly go the Democrats' way. To put that in perspective, with House seats, President Obama lost 63 in 2010, and Trump lost 40 in 2018. So again, if I can put this in sports terms, this is a bases loaded, no out situation for the Democrats and giving up 1 run, okay? Were these results about Biden? It's early, the poll data is sort of yet to be unpacked, but most of the answers say no. The economy was the #1 most cited factor, but it barely outstripped the #2 most cited factor, which was abortion. Poll readers seem to agree that the Dobbs factor cannot be underestimated here. What I want to emphasize in light of the history is that not only, as Matt talked about, was Dobbs considered to be unpopular from a policy point of view, But heading up to the midterms, it allowed the Democrats to campaign in a way which is very unusual for an incumbent party, which is to say being the party of the status quo and going on the attack, right? It is very rare, and this is what happened to the Republican Party, that a party manages to enact a radical, unpopular policy change despite having control of neither House of Congress nor the presidency. So in a sense, Dobbs sort of flipped the balance, the onus of campaigning onto the Republicans, put them on the defensive. As to Biden and the result on him, Biden was also particularly quiet during this electoral cycle. The party managed to make it about issues, not about the president, and that seems to have been a successful strategy in retrospect. In fact, and this is what I want to highlight, many are discussing the results as a referendum on another president. One snarky pundit put it this way: how can we have a referendum on President Biden if the last guy won't get off the stage? So for many, the midterms felt somewhat curiously like a referendum on Donald Trump more than Biden, right? The data that Matt just marshaled, I think, speaks very eloquent to that. The practice of ticket splitting, voting for members of different parties, was all but defunct. And this midterm cycle showed that rear its head again. So some Georgia voters, for instance, seem to have voted for Brian Kemp and Raphael Warnock. So that's a historically anomalous development. But I want to emphasize in sort of larger history, it is very weird that midterm elections should concern the prior president so heavily. Why would that be? My short answer is that Trump and Biden both made it this way. And I think there's a larger story about the development of the presidential role at work here. So very briefly, a quick lesson on presidential theory. One of the main theories of the presidency divides the office into 4 historical periods. The patrician president of the founding, we think George Washington being above party. The party president of the 19th century, we think of the sort of uncharismatic, unmemorable leaders like Millard Fillmore, right? In the 19th century, parties' agenda setting was more the realm of Congress, not the president. The 20th century, the early 20th century, is often characterized as the era of the managerial president, right? Quintessential examples of this are FDR or LBJ, folks who manage more from behind the scenes, building coalition, pushing legislation through Congress, right? And finally, we come to the era that many theorists think defines the present moment, the public presidency, right? These are presidents who give speeches to try to move public opinion, hoping that their popularity pays off ultimately in legislative dividends. So Ronald Reagan was a perfect example of the public presidency. So was George W. Bush. So was Obama, perhaps to a slightly lesser extent. And it's fair to say that Donald Trump was perhaps the apotheosis of the public president. Okay, Biden is certainly not that. Biden did not attempt to shape the party in his own image. Biden is not a particularly great speaker. Being in the spotlight, most people seem to agree, does not favor him. And of course, he's a former senator. So behind the scenes coalitional management plays much more to his strengths. I also believe that Biden sees that sort of public leadership, speech giving, emotional appeals as divisive, right? Why alienate Joe Manchin or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just to put your stamp on the party? Now, I think where I'm getting should be obvious, right? Donald Trump has sort of done the opposite, chosen to make the election a referendum on his candidacy, tried to put his stamp on the Republican Party. Are we seeing a pushback to that? Yes and no, right? Discreetly, yes, in the sense that many of the results seem to have shown a sort of Trump, the opposite of a boost, Trump tax, I guess, for candidates. However, I don't think in the future we're going to roll back any of this president's speech giving sort of leadership, right? So far as we see, Ron DeSantis seems to be taking a page out of the same playbook and just doing it better right now. Okay. What about the presidential agenda going forward? I'll be a little briefer here. It's clear, even though this is a divided Congress at this point, it doesn't seem like the GOP has any sort of mandate to say, we have directions from Americans to take policy in a new direction. It's going to be really interesting to watch the Republican Party how it negotiates its internal divisions. What about the Biden agenda? So Biden, like I said, has been kind of a quintessential managerial president, a builder of coalitions who gets legislation passed, right? So we've seen the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act committing to research, in advanced manufacturing, semiconductor protection, / the Race Against China Act, gun safety laws, et cetera. And of course, numerous actions by executive action on student debt payments and so forth. It's for the GOP, it's going to be well nigh impossible to roll these back. What will be interesting, the only real option is to try to stop agency acting by refusing to fund it. So I would keep an eye out for, a lot of wrangling and tussles in negotiations, especially over the debt ceiling, but also on what Democrats perceive to be must-pass bills, seeing if the GOP manages to attach riders, which roll back agency execution. We'll probably see a lot of conflict here. Biden has said that he's willing to reach across the aisle and work with the other party. There's not a ton of areas of bipartisan consensus right now, but some that I would suggest would be foreign policy. The GOP is deeply divided on this score, and it seems like the majority is more in a Biden camp, specifically on China, Saudi Arabia. On energy, you might be able to see some headway reducing energy costs, and on healthcare, particularly reducing drug costs like insulin, tackling mental health issues, especially when it comes to veterans. So I'll conclude. Biden was asked by reporters the day after the election what he would do differently over the next 2 years, and his response was pretty blunt: nothing. So we'll see about that.
Thank you. Professor Olson.
Great, thank you so much. And excuse me, thanks to Professor Reeves and the Weidenbaum Center for organizing this, and the other panelists for their great insights. What I would sort of like to do is talk through how some of these sort of national themes that have come out of this election are sort of reflected, or how we can learn about them through things in Missouri, Illinois, the St. Louis metro area, things like that. So I think the first theme I'd like to talk about is sort of the red wave that wasn't, right? This has sort of been well reviewed already, but right, nationally, Republican Party fails to take the Senate, really narrowly takes the House, very few gubernatorial pickups, state legislatures, really not much, not what you would expect to see. And this really is sort of a combination, right, of some places like New York and Florida where we do see, I think, what was expected to be nationally, the sort of red wave. Other places, even a little shift towards Democrats, sort of maybe a national red ripple. And here in Missouri and across the river in Illinois, very much saw this sort of status quo hold. Right, Missouri is a very red state. Eric Schmidt wins the Senate race easily. Nobody expected anything differently. But in the state legislature, still the same thing. Nothing really changes. Beforehand, 107 Republicans, now in called races, 108. Before, 48 Democrats, now called races, 49 in the Missouri state legislature. There were vacant seats before. Trust me, I can do math. And the uncalled races seem to be about evenly split. So nothing really changes in the state legislature here in Missouri. Over in Illinois, J.B. Pritzker wins easily. It's a Democratic state. Democrat wins easily. One thing I think is sort of instructive, other people have already spoken a little bit about gerrymandering and redistricting, particularly with respect to race and things like that. One thing that's making national news is New York's sort of failed Democratic gerrymandering plan that if sort of successfully carried off by New York Democrats might have flipped the House. Getting less attention because it worked is Illinois' very successful Democratic gerrymandering plan. Illinois is about a 60-40 state, I would say, but about 75% of the U.S. House seats from Illinois are going to be held by Democrats after this election. They actually lost a seat overall, went from 18 to 17, but the state legislature, in doing its redistricting, increased the number of Democratic seats by 2. And sort of maybe the best example of this is Illinois 13, which is right across the river in East St. Louis. And then if you take I-55 up to Springfield, and then you get on I-72 over to Decatur and to Champaign, you are still in Illinois 13. You can look either way off the highway though, and see very deep red Republican districts. But Illinois 13 is sort of a really clear Democratic gerrymander, and maybe if New York had been able to pull off the same type of thing that Illinois Democrats could, we'd have a slightly different story. And just to that point, nationally, this is sort of an unusual case, I think, since 2010 and 2012 in particular, thinking about gerrymandering, sort of Republicans have been sort of the ones who get blamed for sort of taking this to extremes. And certainly Republicans have the power to gerrymander in more places. But this election will be sort of interesting in that it actually seems like Democrats will end up with more a higher seat share in the US House than they got in terms of national House vote, because in part of places like Illinois. Moving on to sort of a second theme, and this isn't something new, but it's continuing, and so I think it's worth reaffirming. It is continuing urban-rural polarization. So yeah, this is something that we've seen increasingly over time. There are less, I would say, red states and blue states, and more blue cities and red rural areas nowadays. And so in this pattern continued in this midterm. CNN's exit polls had in urban areas sort of a 58-41 Democratic Republican split. Rural areas were flipped, 63 Republican, 34 Democratic, and suburbs were almost straight down the middle. And I think like if you look nationally, there are really few better examples for this type of phenomenon than the St. Louis metro area, where we get this sort of deep blue urban core in the city, fading sort of softly as you move through St. Louis County, inner ring suburbs, University City, Clayton, et cetera, still quite blue. By the time you're out in Chesterfield, you're sort of mixed to red, right? And if you look at the state elections, this is very much what happens. Trudy Bush Valentine wins Kansas City, the city, not the suburbs, Boone County at the University of Missouri, St. Louis City, and St. Louis County, and nowhere else in the state of Missouri. And so this is just sort of a pattern that I think is continuing, and that particularly if you look at these sort of urban islands, if you look at a map, an election map, you get these sort of blue dots in a sea of red throughout the middle of the country, and this seems like something that's not really going away. And finally, the thing I want to spend the most time on, and others have sort of alluded to this point a little bit, is that candidate quality really seems to matter, and voters sort of pay attention to candidates. At least enough voters pay attention to candidates to make a difference in some cases. And so, nationally, we saw sort of Kemp outpace Herschel Walker in Georgia, right, to what seems to be a meaningful, it is a meaningful degree because there's going to be a Senate runoff. We see Shapiro outpacing Fetterman like dramatically, even though both Democrats are going to win in Pennsylvania. There's a huge gap between the vote shares that they get. Tony Evers outpaces Mandela Barnes in Wisconsin, such that now there's going to be a Democratic governor, but a Republican senator from Wisconsin, which is the status quo, and similarly in Nevada and some other places, we get this sort of pattern. And this seems to be shaped by how good candidates are, which is easy to say in hindsight, much harder to say beforehand. But it seems fair to say that Doug Mastriano is not a good candidate for governor in Pennsylvania. Herschel Walker is probably not a very good candidate for Senate in Georgia. And ultimately, voters seem to have paid attention to these things and voted accordingly. And so I just like thinking about that locally. There are some really interesting things that happened in the St. Louis metro area. So I think the thing that jumps out to me most is the St. Louis County executive race, which pits Sam Page, the incumbent Democrat, against Mark Mantovani, who is a former Democrat, but was selected after the primary by the Republicans to be their candidate. And so this is, sort of a weakish candidate in Page, insofar as there have been sort of repeated scandal type things. People weren't necessarily happy with his handling of the pandemic. Meanwhile, Mark Mantovani is like demonstrably moderate, like he used to be a Democrat, and he stays pro-choice. He's moderate, and so what this ends up producing is like a really close race in what really shouldn't be a particularly close jurisdiction. I mean, St. Louis County is probably 60% Democratic. Sam Page ultimately gets 51.5% of the vote, so he sort of hangs on. But I mean, just to give you an example, the very nice neighborhood across Big Bend, like literally behind over here, votes for Trudy Bush Valentine with like almost 60% of the vote, I think, but gives Mark Mantovani a slight edge. So sorry if any of you live there and I just outed your neighbors. Yeah, we can compare this to sort of the other Democrats running in St. Louis County at the time. Justin Zimmerman running for assessor, 57.5%, so overperforming Page by 6 percentage points. Trudy Bush Valentine gets 61% of the vote, so overperforming Page by almost 10 percentage points. So this is sort of an interesting case of like candidate people paying attention, particularly for, we think about local elections as maybe low information settings. People don't sort of know candidates. They don't, get as much press. They don't run as many ads. But this seems to have been a case where, Mantovani even gets in the race kind of late, and people seem to have paid attention and changed their votes accordingly. Just one more example from Missouri, the biggest statewide race for state government, at least this year, was for state auditor, which is an important role. And interestingly, is the only statewide elected office currently held by a Democrat in Missouri, Nicole Galloway, who ran for governor in 2020 unsuccessfully. For this race, there was one candidate in the Democratic primary who won, Alan Green, who most recently was a state House member from North County, so not a particularly big role, all things considered. And his most recent election before 2022 was a third place finish out of 3 in a state Senate primary in North County. So, no offense to Alan Green, but probably not like an outstanding candidate. And yet for this quite important statewide office, sort of what the Democrats could muster. And he runs against like a very good candidate, the current state treasurer, Scott Fitzpatrick, and unsurprisingly, given both the nature of the state and their sort of relative qualifications, loses quite badly. And so I just think it's interesting to contrast this case, whereas in some other places we see sort of better sacrificial lambs, if you will, people like Beto O'Rourke, who, regardless of what you think of him, is like, on paper, a high quality candidate, former U.S. House member, things like former statewide candidate for office, who was also almost certainly going down to defeat. And so I just wanted to sort of, there's this sort of give and take in candidate quality where prospects for winning affect who decides to throw their hat in the ring, affects prospects for winning, and back and forth. And we sort of see that playing out here in Missouri.
Great, thank you so much. So now we're going to turn to the Q&A. So I'm going to ask you if you have any questions and sort of recognize you. You can shout your question out. I'll ask the panelists, or maybe I can just go ahead and repeat what you've asked, and we'll take it from there. What are your questions for our panelists?
And/or first, it seems overly manipulative by the existing parties. So why is it even allowed to do that? Where I would assume it's being done by partisan aspects in regard. And contrary in some of the things that were being said, I remember growing up in the county when Larry Reeves was our county executive, a Republican, Gene McNary was a Republican. So is that a gerrymandering transition of the location that changed? Because mostly city, St. Louis has been Democratic, as has been the county. So is it that, and is that a wrongfully utilized manipulative tactic?
So I'll just repeat the question. The question is about sort of why is gerrymandering allowed in the first place, and maybe specifically locally, whether any of our panelists know how it's evolved over time, maybe locally or nationally. Does anybody want to take that question?
So I'll answer as to the federal problem than the Missouri specific one. So the same constitutional provision I read out earlier, the so-called elections clause, about when not giving kind of power to state legislatures. That's why congressional districts are drawn in that manner. The founding fathers didn't really recognize the risk of parties in gerrymandering when they wrote that into the Constitution, and it hasn't been changed since then. The Supreme Court heard a case in 2019 called Rucho versus Common Cause and said that for purposes of the Equal Protection Clause, there is no prohibition against partisan gerrymandering because it's a non-justiciable political question. The court kind of looked at all the very robust political science developments over the past generation and said, we don't understand this, we're not going to police it. Now, within states and within localities, it's very much tied to the state constitution. Many states have enacted anti-gerrymandering provisions, whether or not they are substantive rules against it, where you kind of have to push for more equal representation between the parties, or kind of an institutionalist change where you give the power of the pen, for lack of a better term, to independent redistricting commissions. Now, here in Missouri, for state legislative districts, there was an amendment passed a few years ago that would have created a state demographer, that would have put restrictions on partisan gerrymandering. But you might recall in the fall of 2020, there was an amendment, Amendment 3, that when you looked at it on paper, looked pretty good. It was like, we're going to change the ethics rules. They only changed it by $5. We're going to require more disclosure. There was pretty good disclosure to begin with. And oh, by the way, we're going to change the rules for drawing lines on the map. But then didn't really unpack that what they did was dismantle the prior reform. And that passed very narrowly. And that passed very much on an urban-rural divide here in the state. But that's why some of these problems for state legislative races continue in Missouri.
Great. Next question, all the way in the back. Be sure to shout it out.
Oh, yes, sir. I understand New York. It's sort of like a situation with Carnahan running for president. Long didn't really manage that well, but Florida, I'm trying to, can you talk about how the gerrymandering or the voter gerrymandering or voter suppression played in Florida?
The question is about gerrymandering and voter suppression in Florida.
Oh, yes. Yeah, great question. So I think Florida's a really interesting case in this particular setting. So I think certainly you can point to sort of a to gerrymandering at the state level, sort of led by Governor DeSantis, but that doesn't really undo the fact that statewide candidates got, I think Marco Rubio ended up with 57 and DeSantis with 59% of the vote. So you can't gerrymander states, and those are fairly overwhelming victories. So I think at that point you have to think about the popularity of policies. DeSantis is a fairly popular governor. Sort of shocking, as someone who came of political age, a decade ago. But Miami-Dade County, I think, ended up Republican this year for the first time in my memory, which is this part of this sort of demographic, or not demographic shift, but political shift among Latinos in Florida, which I'm sure Matthew can talk more about. But that I think, for a long time, that was sort of on election night. If Florida was close, Democrats waited for Miami-Dade and Broward to sort of come in, and this year that wouldn't have done any good. So I think it's sort of strikes me as less a gerrymandering problem and more sort of just political preferences being played out at the state level.
Yeah, I think to follow up on that, when I was growing up, Florida was a purple state, right? We thought about it as this sort of toss-up state. It's a very red state now. It is a Republican-leaning state, and part of that is demographic. So Latinos in Florida trend towards the Republican Party. A lot of those are Cuban Americans who are much more conservative. It's also worth noting that Florida has had one of the harshest felon disenfranchisement laws in the country, where if you were convicted of a felony, you were prohibited from voting for the rest of your life. Now people who committed certain classes of felonies can get their voting rights back. But that has led Florida to be, much like Texas, a very low turnout state in general. And low turnout elections and low turnout states tend to also favor Republicans, especially in sort of midterm elections.
Marissa.
What you think the role was. So it seems like there's a few things going on, because there's 6 states with a ballot issue. So it seems like this can really mobilize people in a policy rate. Then there's other states where I guess the question is the sense mostly that voters are angry and are coming out and punishing the GOP for what's already happened? Or is the sense that this is something more forward-looking? And kind of footnote to that last part of the question, what in the world was Lindsey Graham? That's my thought.
So
If we win, we're gonna have a federal ban, right?
So the question is about the Dobbs decision. What was motivating voters in that regard? Was it about punishing the GOP or being forward-looking? And then an additional question about the strategy behind Lindsey Graham proposing a national ban on abortion.
A quick cut at this, but then I would defer to people who know the polling data a little bit better than myself. I think, what was Lindsey Graham thinking? I don't know, that was part of the question, but I'll make it part of the question. No, I mean, I think there's a genuine question. And I think that this quandary can certainly be posed to the Democrats as well, but it certainly seems to be becoming more of an issue for the Republicans about the effect of primary elections on what is considered to be sort of the core constituency of the base. I think that Lindsey Graham was speaking to the ardent, energized, excited, pro-life camp of the Republican Party and sort of throwing them some fresh meat. The midterm suggests that that was a gross miscalculation about how the general electorate felt about reproductive rights generally. But I think that the interesting tension there is pointing toward primary elections and, proposals for reform, which seems to be sort of trickling up at the state level. I think that's going to be something to watch. Ranked choice voting was on the ballot in a couple of states. Would that help shift, candidate choice back to the center? I think that's interesting. And then were voters angry or forward looking? I think, again, the answer is yes. Again, what I suggested was distinctive about Dobbs was that generally the party that is not in power does not have the opportunity to move the needle on policy. And the Supreme Court did that in a way that flipped the Democrats from defensive incumbents into look what's about to happen. And again, I feel like people like Lindsey Graham did the party no favors by saying the complete ban is coming.
I think to follow up on that, especially on the what is Lindsey Graham thinking? I think the GOP for a while has built itself sort of an echo chamber in terms of polling and media environment, and they've drank the Kool-Aid, and they think that voters actually support their policies because their polls are bad. Like if you look at exit polling and pre-election polling by like Trafalgar Group, it's wildly out of line with everyone else. I remember this going back to 2012. Right, the Mitt Romney camp actually expected a victory because their polling was bad. So I think part of it might be that Lindsey Graham and Republican leadership think that Americans are actually okay with Roe v. Wade being repealed. I do think it's anger, right? So I don't want to go too deep of a dive into sort of political psychology here. But if we think about the emotional responses of voters, anger is the most mobilizing emotion. Right? Fear typically isn't going to do it. It's anger. And when you take away people's right, especially a right that's been guaranteed for 50 years, that's going to make a lot of people angry. And that sort of policy victory isn't going to generate enough enthusiasm on the other side to counteract that anger. And so I do think that it was anger in these contexts. And we saw these ballot initiatives winning or failing in remarkable places, right? Kentucky, which is by no means a purple state, shot down their ballot initiative, which would have restricted reproductive rights. Montana was trying to pass a very sort of convoluted law about sort of the rights of the unborn. Montana is by no means a purple state. People support reproductive rights being decisions made by women and parents and their doctors, and not by Lindsey Graham. I think that they somehow were able to convince themselves that wasn't true.
So I'm going to throw out two questions that have come up on Zoom, and you can a la carte decide which one you want to answer. One question has to do with whether or not Biden's executive action around student loans, whether there's any evidence that that made a difference in the midterms. And then the other question has to do with the future of the moderate Republican, question mark. So take your pick.
So I guess I'll start on the student loan thing. So from the survey data that I've seen, and this is all very fresh and preliminary, I don't think it played a huge role. I think the student loan forgiveness was broadly popular. The people it was most popular for were younger Americans who tend not to vote in particularly high numbers. Americans 18 to 29 were very supportive of Biden's student loan forgiveness plan. Older Americans less so. And compared to things like inflation, gas prices, and reproductive rights, this was not the major issue people were thinking of. So I doubt that it played a huge role in getting people to turn out to vote. Although certainly that was, I think, important in 2020 and especially in the Georgia runoff.
You know, I'll just kind of add one thing to what Professor Hayes said on that, kind of looking forward on the student loan forgiveness. So several lawsuits have been filed across the country. Most of them are clear non-starters because the plaintiffs lack standing. However, in my view, the most dangerous or good lawsuit, depending on your particular perspective, to actually have a chance of succeeding is filed here in the Eastern District of Missouri in St. Louis by Missouri and some other states, because Missouri has an agency that processes student loan payments. And so they arguably have standing. And so the district court here said that there was no standing, but the Eighth Circuit issued an administrative stay and earlier this week issued a short opinion, basically saying we're going to keep the status quo. We're not going to allow these debts to be discharged. And, you know, not to get too much into the weeds, because this is a panel on midterm elections, not administrative law or statutory interpretation, but the Biden administration's legal rationale for this is probably not on the strongest legal footing. And given the composition of the Eighth Circuit, I would not be terribly surprised if they were to strike it down. And so this might be going up to the Supreme Court, and to borrow Professor Katz's phrase, might allow the Democrats to once again kind of play on the offense for all the people who would be upset when they thought that their loans would be being forgiven and not being forgiven 2 years later.
George.
I just saw a chart this morning on the television saying that the two big issues that they were talking about were the abortion issue and the inflation issue. It seems to me why most of these polls were wrong is at the very end, people began to realize that there was an overriding issue of all of these, and that was whether our form of government was going to survive. And I think that had more to do with the surprises we got than anything else. It seems to, I had several friends that couldn't pull a lever for the other party because their families for years had been in one party. And even though they recognized the danger and the issues, they still weren't able to make an adjustment. But I think there were many others that began to say, whoa, all these other things fall in line if we lose our republic.
Great comment. So the comment had to do with the relative importance of democracy vis-a-vis other issues like abortion and inflation. If our panelists have any thoughts on how that played in the election, love to hear it.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in. I think this is a really interesting point. It certainly seems like voters rejected people who denied the results of the 2020 election. You know, it's a little hard to say because it's sort of correlated with being endorsed by former President Trump, which may or may not have been a drag independent of attitudes towards the 2020 election. So it's kind of, you know, sussing those things out might be a little complicated. But certainly the fact that sort of Carrie Lake sort of falls short and Blake Masters in Arizona, and particularly I think Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania is sort of the clearest example of this. I think I actually saw something that Josh Shapiro, the Democrat, would have beaten Doug Mastriano even if you threw out Philadelphia and Allegheny counties in Pennsylvania. So I mean that is just a rout. There's really no other way to put it. And so, and he's sort of Doug Mastriano, sort of the clearest example because he's sort of like, you know, actually involved on January 6th, sort of unapologetically. That said, I think, you know, one of the more interesting things to come out of this election, particularly after what we witnessed in 2020, is a lot of concessions. Doug Mastriano concedes to Josh Shapiro, Blake Masters and Carrie Lake sort of tepidly concede to their opponents in Arizona. People who I think it's fair to say in 2020 would not have been doing that, sort of admitting that they lost, you know, even if they're sort of like, oh, there were irregularities, but still admitting that they lost. So I think that is both good for American democracy and maybe suggestive that there's been a sort of rapid realization that denying that elections are free and fair isn't a good way to win them.
And I'll just kind of jump in there. I agree with what you said, Professor Olson, but just kind of looking forward, I don't think we've kind of stuck the landing quite yet, for lack of a better term, but it does reduce my heartburn going into 2024 that a lot of the kind of Secretary of State races, the gubernatorial races, the people that control the election machinery, the people that will certify the election results in 2024 are people, either they are Republicans who accept the election results or they are Democrats who accept the election results. And so going into the next cycle, that's a lot better than having someone like Mastriano in Pennsylvania, who if, you know, Biden runs for re-election and wins, you might see shenanigans going on in Harrisburg trying to stop a certification there.
I saw something about 300 people that were Trumpies. Of those, only 108, I think, they said won their primaries to be the candidate. So he didn't prevail in terms of people who were following him, and that I think made the difference. Just from what I'm reading.
Yeah, so just to follow up and just to make sure that everyone at home could hear the comment, of the 300 or so Trump back candidates, only about 100 of them kind of made it through. I've seen similar figures, and it kind of depends on what your universe of offices you're looking at is. But even though there are certainly some people who deny the results of the 2020 election who won office, and that's, you know, largely sometimes due to uncompetitive safe seats drawn by gerrymandering, the fact that the sort of top offices, the people who are in control of kind of sending the electoral college votes to Congress, that's going to matter a lot. And so the fact that, you know, I'm not diminishing the threat to our democracy, given that some people still got through, but I'm feeling a lot better than I was a month ago in terms of how bad things could get in 2024. Because, I mean, just keep in mind, 2020 was a pretty clear victory for Biden. I mean, the number of states that you had to flip was enormous. It was not 2000, where Florida was all that really mattered. And so, you know, if 2024 is really, really close, you don't want it to come down to Pennsylvania with someone who still denies how 2020 came out.
I think if I can follow up on this, I think we can also tie this into what happens to moderate Republicans. Politics has been sort of the line of cleavage in politics has been shifted to talk about people who support democracy versus those who question it. And I'm less worried about 2024 now, but I'm still worried. And the reason why is because this division is actually really good for Democrats. Most Americans like democracy and like elections and like believing in elections and believe that elections are free and fair. So this is a winning issue for Democrats. They have every incentive to keep playing a role in Republican primaries to make sure that the most extreme election denying Republicans advance so that they can beat them. That worked in 2022, but it is a dangerous game that I do worry we might see again in 2024. And I think right now what a moderate Republican is has changed from, 20 years ago. Now a moderate Republican is, regardless of your policy positions, do you accept the results of elections or not? Right? That's a moderate Republican. To the extent that that's going to be the case, I think there's going to be a lot of incentive for these much more extreme fringe candidates to emerge and get support.
You mentioned the U.S. Supreme Court. How is that going?
So the question is, how will the Supreme Court come out at the end of all this? You mean in the context of Congress and reforming the courts, or in what way?
Well, in terms of a lot of people don't see the Supreme Court as being a very just. That's the last place you could receive justice, and a lot of people are against it. So right now, what is it, 6-3 or something like that? They don't seem to be leaning towards people who are trying to have the grievances addressed, and it's building more and more to me, to my mind. Anyway, I'm just wondering how that's going to come out. Are they going to stack it
Gotcha. So the
Before
question is
justice.
about the legitimacy of the Supreme Court and
That's it,
whether we
that's
might
it.
see any potential reforms in the next couple of years.
Right.
That's the nice thing about having life tenure. Nobody can fire you when they think you're doing a bad job. So I mean, the justices aren't going to go anywhere. We're in a world. So back to what I was saying about the presidency and the president's increasing role in setting the national policy agenda. Biden never wanted to touch this issue. And that certainly won't happen in the next couple years. I think it would take a radical, so just to state the obvious, you wouldn't see a push to reform the Supreme Court from Republicans. The current Democratic Party has zero appetite to do this. I think they perceive that issue would be a loser, painting them as sort of the radical anti-rule of law party. You know, it's been done. Obviously, the size of the Supreme Court has grown and shrunk, but it hasn't changed since just after the Civil War. So I don't really see any real institutional consequences for the bench. People can rant and rave about legitimacy all they want. Those grievances are pertinent, I think, but I don't see any institutional change coming from any of this.
And I'll just add real quick that, you know, the court has shifted to the right very quickly, and the nominations and the circumstances of those nominations are incredibly controversial. But I agree with Professor Katz, those conservatives aren't going anywhere. We're not going to pack the court. But keep in mind, in 2020, numerous cases went up to the court. Many red states followed an original action in the Supreme Court trying to get them to, you know, meddle in some of the election results. The court batted those down left and right. The court did not want to get involved in this. I think the court realizes that its institutional legitimacy, to the extent that it still exists, is on it trying to at least be above partisan politics, not politics, but partisan politics, and get and intervene in an election. And so to me, the way that the federal courts held and rejected the baseless claims of fraud, followed in all these lawsuits across the country, from Supreme Court on down to the lower district courts, was very reassuring from a preservation of democracy perspective.
Been surprised that we don't talk at all about the accuracy of voter rolls. I know in 2019, Judicial Watch did win a court case against Los Angeles County and the state of California, which having 1.5 million illegal people on their voter rolls. There is a law by the United States that states have to clean their voter rolls. And it seems that the federal government isn't looking at that at all. And something like Judicial Watch is the only person that has any say in filing suits against different states to clean their election rolls. And that's the easiest way to, especially with mailing out ballots to everybody on the rolls, that's the easiest way for voter fraud and the hardest way to prove voter fraud. If you don't have any signature or some validating thing that goes along with the ballot. And nobody talks about that aspect of the whole election process.
So the question is about some of the challenges that come along with election administration, in particular, accuracy of voter laws and the voter rolls, and the importance of keeping those up to date.
So I'll weigh in on this. I think it's a complicated issue. I think the federal government isn't going to do much about this because this is mostly up to the states. Where this gets challenging is cleaning up voter rolls is very hard. And if you are purging voter rolls of people you suspect might have passed away or moved out of state, where there's not an exact match on their names, there are people who are much more likely to miss that, right? So African Americans are much more likely to have hyphenated names, to have misspellings in government documents, and so they're much more likely to get purged incorrectly from voter rolls. So there is some danger to overpolicing this. Certainly we need to keep accurate voter rolls, but voter fraud doesn't happen very often. We're talking maybe dozens of cases nationwide, but never enough to affect any election. And when there are mail-in ballots, almost all states that I'm aware of, so Colorado, which has sort of entirely mail-in ballots, there's a signature match with your voter registration, which is imperfect, admittedly. But it's simply not the case that thousands of people, or let alone millions of people, are returning ballots. That just doesn't happen because the consequences of voting incorrectly are so severe. So in Florida, for example, Governor DeSantis started a new sort of election security force, and they arrested a number of voters for voting improperly after the state sent them information about how to register to vote, and other groups said that they were eligible because of the new law sort of allowing ex-felons to vote. They're going to prison for many years for doing this. There's just it's hard enough getting, as someone who teaches undergraduate students, it's hard enough getting them to turn out to vote when there's a voting booth like on campus. Getting someone to turn out to vote if there's a risk of going to prison for 5 years just is so incredibly rare that I think we have to think about the actual costs that we're sort of imposing on people who might be improperly purged if we're a little overly zealous about that.
I'll just,
Go ahead. Yeah.
If I heard your earlier comment correctly, can you shed some more light on the Warnock Walker contest and why African Americans and Latino voters would have stayed at home and not voted? That seems like one of the most important Senate races in the country before November the 8th. I can't comprehend why people whose self-interest so affected by the outcome of that race would choose not to participate in that election.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, it's complicated. Georgia having this runoff system affects the calculus. So what we saw in 2020, where it went to a runoff, turnout spiked for that runoff because control of the Senate hung in the balance. So Georgia will not be pivotal for control of the Senate. So that might have contributed to it somewhat. Georgia is also a state where it's not particularly easy to register and turn out to vote. And it's been getting harder to register and turn out to vote over time in Georgia. I don't know if they've enacted many changes between 2020 and 2022, but that certainly probably affected it some. But part of it is also that turnout was just lower this election than in 2018 in Georgia. So everyone's overall statewide turnout was down as a proportion of the voting age population. And it was down more for Black and Latino voters than for white voters. And I think that's probably has to do with in 2018, this was very much a response to President Trump, whereas this is sort of maybe a response to President Trump, maybe a response to the status quo. My expectation is very much that this runoff is not going to be particularly close because I think now that people have some priors about how close it is, Black turnout is probably going to be much higher in this runoff than we'd anticipate if there's early voting provisions, which is what they're fighting right now.
A question for Professor Katz, at least to start off with. In terms of your expectations about how Biden will use his unilateral powers in the next couple of years, what are you expecting to see?
Expansively? Yeah, I mean, it's been at one time, in political science, it was popular to say that divided government could be productive from a legislative, passing laws point of view. That thesis seems to be somewhat out of date based on the patterns of recent years, right? So divided government, which is to say where one party, doesn't hold the presidency, Congress, and both houses of Congress. So we're entering a period of divided government. It tends to be less productive legislatively, acrimonious, and it tends to see higher levels of executive action. Biden hasn't been particularly timid about executive action. Again, to the question about the freezing of student loan debt surfaces here. I think the real constraining factor, the real wild card Sorry, let me bifurcate the answer first. I think that when it comes to the foreign policy agenda, there is still a lot of room to be pursued in the legislative route. So I would still expect to see sort of more legislation when it comes to foreign policy. On the domestic route, I would expect to see increased use of executive orders, with the caveat that the courts are kind of a wild card factor here. Again, as Professor Crum was discussing, the legality of freezing student debt loan repayment is currently being litigated right now. And this could easily go down as a loss for the Biden administration. So I would expect sort of muscular use of it, but I would also expect plenty of lawsuits.
George?
Supreme Court, don't you think the Supreme Court would rather act by the way McConnell handled Garland? I mean, that was untold a year before, and he gets Amy Barrett a month before. It seems to me that the court's been packed in a different way than numbers, but by the way, very way that the controlling senator handled it.
So the comment reflects how maybe the nomination process around the court has changed with respect to various, at least political precedents, especially as we think of and contrast what happened with Merrick Garland with some of the Trump appointees and how that fares for the future of the court.
So, you know, I don't disagree that norms were broken throughout that entire process. One thing I could commend to you, although I do think that reform moving forward is not going to happen because the Democrats don't have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, is a paper by two of our colleagues at the law school, Professor Rosma and Professor Epps, who look at various plans to reform the Supreme Court and start shortly after World War II and kind of go through what the Supreme Court would have looked like over the past 6-7 decades if those reform plans have been in place. And the findings are very interesting. You don't get the kind of big swing to the right that you see now. It's a much more moderate court that is responsive to, you know, each election, where presidents are more likely to get or just certain to get certain numbers of appointments during their terms in offices. So you don't get situations like Trump gets 3 picks during his presidency because of the Garland fiasco. You don't get Obama getting only 2 picks in 2 terms, and you don't get Jimmy Carter getting 0 picks in his 1 term.
On the federal bench, the McConnell put 143 federal judges in. Those people are there for life. And the thing's going to happen now. That's why the Democrats coming back. I think Biden will do the same thing, loading up with federal judges. And that has a lot to do with what's happened. If you look what happened in Florida with Mar-a-Lago, that gal that was appointed, never been a judge or a trial lawyer. She's the one that came down with as a federal judge with all those initial findings for the Mar-a-Lago thing. So that's part of how those courts get packed, if you will.
So I agree with everything that you've described. I mean, I think, you know, I think many of us on the panel would prefer to see bipartisan big legislation and compromises, right? Instead, what we see is unilateralism. One president packs the bench, then the next president packs the bench. I think executive orders generally fall under this category. We're in a time of unilateralism, right? Biden is going to continue to pack the bench, though, with control of the Senate. If that's comforting to you, great. If not, we're going to just, you know, this is a continuation of this continued pattern. I don't see like massive compromise happening in Congress. It's going to be control of the bench, at least for the next couple of years.
So let me throw out 2 questions from Zoom. One question has to do with the fact that you know, Biden did have some legislative accomplishments. If we think about the American Rescue Plan, the child tax credit, and some other things, those didn't seem to register strongly with voters. Also, that's true with respect to some of the foreign policy, the very high profile foreign policy that the Biden administration has pursued. So did they have an impact? And if not, why? Oh, and then I'll throw the second question out, which is Clearly, people are concerned about this idea of voter fraud. What are the safeguards around preventing people from doing this? Matthew, you talked about, there's heavy legal tolls, but are there other ways that, states safeguard against people voting, 2, 3, 4, 5 times?
Can I take that latter question
Please.
first? Yeah, so I think we can turn this on its head, right? So we need to make sure that our elections are secure. We need to make sure that voters know that their vote is going to be counted and there aren't going to be illegitimate or illegal votes cast. The easiest way to do that are things like having national voter identification that are issued to Americans that they don't have to pay for, right? So right now in Missouri, you need a photo ID to vote. To get one is, driver's licenses cost money. You can get a voter ID just to vote, but you need to know that you can do that for free, right? So we could streamline that by having national voter identification. Some states have gone to mail-in ballots, which don't seem to have any higher rate of voter malfeasance or voting irregularities and are easier for people to vote. It's made Colorado a higher turnout state. And some states have even gone to same-day voter registration. Instead of having to know you need to register to vote in October for a November election, as long as you're there on election day, you can register to vote and vote. And that would only cause a problem if someone is driving from Illinois to Missouri to vote and then over to Nebraska. And with the penalties for that kind of in-person voter fraud being what they are, and the ease of catching that sort of thing, I think if we make it easier to vote, people will feel a little bit more secure that there are no shenanigans in sort of election administration. So,
Yeah, one thing I would add there is I think one of the ways in which the kind of big lie gets perpetuated is you have some states where, the types of voters who are voting are different in terms of election day and mail-in ballots. And that got exacerbated during the pandemic because Trump cast such doubt in the security of absentee ballots. And so Republican voters tended to vote in person, Democratic voters tended to vote using mail-in ballots. Now, any election reform policymaker will tell you, you should probably start counting the ballots when they arrive because they could get damaged in the interim. It's just faster. You're spreading out manpower longer. But the Republican-controlled state legislatures in the Rust Belt declined to do that, despite everyone telling them that was best elections practices, because they wanted to have that blue wave come after they wanted the dynamic such that when the polls would close, you would see some of the results come in from the actual polling places, and then the results would start shifting as the mail-in ballots were counted. So, if we want to have reform, maybe, we should start at the state level. Maybe Congress should step in because Congress could mandate this for federal elections. If they mandate it for federal elections, states will do it for state and local elections as well for cost reasons.
And any evidence that Biden's legislative accomplishments or foreign policy affected the vote?
Yeah, I'll take this. I would say no, they didn't probably. All the best evidence in political science is that voters really don't respond very much to policymaking in Congress, which isn't all that surprising. Like they've a lot of things to pay attention to and keeping a tally sheet of how the Biden administration is doing is sort of low on that list of priorities, I think. But yeah, so the very, very short answer is probably it didn't make much of a difference.
One last question. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's been fascinating, great questions from everyone else also. My question is in the vein of election denying. I think at first when Trump started talking about that in 2020, I mean, my thought was like, oh, it's just really one of those one-off it's gonna go away. Then not only did it not go away, but there's candidates in the midterm election ran on with the promise that 2020 election had been stolen. My question is, why do you think that was demonstrated as effective strategy? Why wasn't there more of that, especially when the Democrats did much better? There was no red wave, many no one thought they had to be winning, and actually candidates themselves who had run on a election night actually lost. Why wasn't more election night, but why wasn't there more like, oh, Democrats stole the midterm or anything like that?
So why not more election denialism in the post-midterm era that we find ourselves in now?
I may sound naive here, but I would like to think that most people who run for office do so because they want to serve the public. And so I hope that most are not so cynical to repeat things that they don't actually believe in order to get elected, especially when sort of American democracy hangs in the balance. But the sort of more complicated and less sort of satisfying answer is I think a lot of this has to do with primaries, where sort of establishment Republicans have always been, since 2016, very skeptical of Donald Trump. And as a result, have not sort of leaned in. I think the 2022 elections were very much a wait and see election. And given how poorly a lot of these candidates fared, even if some aspects of the GOP want to continue this sort of relitigation of the 2020 election, I think by and large, this is an issue that Republican elites want to avoid because they've seen how it played out. I think a lot of them were skeptical going into 2022, including even Lindsey Graham, right? Were skeptical that this was going to be a winning strategy.
And I would just add there that the election denialism did not start in 2020. When Trump lost the Iowa caucus to Ted Cruz in 2016, he claimed fraud. Like, that is literally people voting in public. You can count them. There's no secret ballot. And this is just someone who is unwilling to admit when he's lost something. And, you know, maybe I'll sound naive here, but it comes to character. It comes to people being willing to say when they lost and, you know, being willing to concede and fight another day.
We're actually over time. I want to thank all of you for making the track on a cold November day to be here with us. And I want to give a big round of applause to our fantastic team.